Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod. I'm Brian Morgenstern here with Sam Lyman. If you like what you see today, like and subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at MorgensternNJ, at SamLyman33. We have a lot to dig into. So, Sam, where do you want to get started?
Let's get started with The Economist, one of the most reputable publications, or so we would think, right? But The Economist this last week had a major hit piece on Bitcoin miners in Texas. Can you pull that article up, Dylan? So this included a salacious headline, Why Texas Republicans Are Souring on Crypto. They're not mincing words or their agenda with that kind of headlines. This story has in it a number of falsehoods, a number of points that can be easily debunked. And we want to dedicate the first portion of our podcast today to debunking The Economist hit piece on Bitcoin mining, talking about the origins of this story, the initial drafts of it, which actually weren't as salacious as the draft that we ended up seeing getting published, and just how that all happened. And then we're going to zoom out and talk about why does the mainstream media get Bitcoin so wrong, not only in 2024, but since its inception. So Brian, let's start there because I know you had a lot to say about this particular article from The Economist and really just took them to task on Twitter. So, what are your thoughts on this article and how would you debunk it?
Yeah, actually, Dylan, do you have my tweet handy? Uh, yeah, I graded them an F, and that's just 10 things that were wrong with the article. So where to begin? So we'll start with the title saying Texas Republicans are souring on Bitcoin. No, there were two officials who had some questions and some concerns, and we are working to address those. There isn't really any issue of the Texas government trying to drive an industry to leave the state. I mean, it's just so salacious and absurd. Then it says that we make more money, or miners make more money selling power than they do mining Bitcoin. That is objectively false. They took one snapshot in time and then just declared, when temperatures were very high, and so miners were able to sell power to the wholesale market, which just reduces their average cost over time. But they made it seem like all the revenue for these companies is coming from power sales. It's not revenue, and it is tiny compared to what companies make mining Bitcoin, where that's their principal operation. So it's just false. And then the overall premise that Texas Republicans are souring on Bitcoin. Meanwhile, we just had President Trump give a huge pro Bitcoin speech. I just attended an event with Senator Cruz where he was praising Bitcoin as a tool for freedom and Bitcoin mining the industry as a safety blanket, providing real-time resilience to the energy grid in Texas. Could not have been more effusive in his praise. So the Economist's headline and subheadline right out of the gate, objectively, provably, easily provably false. Fake news. Like straight out of the gate, the headline and subheadline are fake news. Then I'll just touch on a few other points. I don't want to spend our entire time talking about this stupid hit piece, but they said that grid demand in Texas is going to double before the end of the decade. There was just a UT Austin and Inveris study that said that that's not true and said the estimate's more like a 10% growth rate. Meanwhile, there's multiples of that in the generation queue to come online to supply the increased demand. So no mention of that very important context. Instead, because they wanted to use the word crisis, because they say Bitcoin miners are taking advantage of an energy crisis that doesn't exist. So again, fake news. They even in this article cited, this kills me. I get so annoyed by this stupid this stupid article because they even cited a nonprofit that is funded by the George Soros Open Society Foundations, which wants like a new world order centralized government. Surprise, surprise, they don't like Bitcoin. They claimed falsely that Bitcoin miners are wasting taxpayer dollars. That doesn't make any sense. Bitcoin miners don't get any taxpayer dollars. It's just a lie. But again, the venerable Economist is citing them as a credible source. It's totally crazy. Two final points that are just insane. And again, I could go on about how this article is just fake news all day, but two final points. One, it referenced me and said that when I go talk to legislators, which I do frequently, that I'm trying to persuade them to let Bitcoin mining as an industry stay in Texas. And I'm just begging them to let us say, please, sir, may we stay in Texas, please? Like, no, I was explaining that I go and have very productive conversations about rural economic development, about regulations that pertain to the energy grid, just trying to help the policymakers understand the business. But the way the Economist portrayed it is absurd. And then finally, they said that Governor Abbott may not want Bitcoin mining in the state anymore. He has never said anything remotely close to that. They invented that opinion out of whole cloth. And they said that his opinion could be affected by President Trump's position because he is pining for a cabinet position. The governor himself said he's not. So again, they made it up out of whole cloth. This is amazing to me that the venerable Economist, this institution of high-minded thought, just wrote fake news. It's just an entirely made-up hit piece, and it's very unfortunate. But let me stop my rant there. And Sam, I don't know if you have any further thoughts on like the editorial process. I wasn't that intimately involved. I did an interview with the reporter, which she then butchered, or maybe it was her editor. I don't know, but yeah,
Yeah,
bad job, Economist. Failing grade.
an F. That's pretty brutal, but given everything that you laid out there, it's hard to grade it anything otherwise. It was really disappointing coming from The Economist. And as far as what happened in the story writing process, my understanding in talking to one of our colleagues was that this reporter actually had really positive engagement with you, Brian, with Pierre as well. And apparently her initial draft was much different than the draft that ended up getting published. And the editor took the piece and found a way to make it salacious, to insert blatant falsehoods into the piece, a headline that is built to stir controversy. It's really, really disappointing. But of course, mainstream media has an incentive to stir controversy wherever they can. The truth is that over time, Bitcoin mining will become more and more integrated into the grid in Texas for many reasons. But one of the biggest reasons is that we are one of the principal instigators in bringing new generation online. Over the next 6 years here, by the end of the decade, we know we need to bring a lot of generation online to the Texas grid and honestly to the grid across the country. And what's going to make that possible are Bitcoin miners, because Bitcoin miners are guaranteed customers for power companies. These companies, they need to have an economically viable business model. They need to have customers as often as they can to be able to build out their projects. And they need the financing to do it. And who's going to supply that 24/7 demand? That's Bitcoin. Who's going to supply some of that financing? Just watch, it's going to be Bitcoin miners as well. So this attempt by the media to frame Bitcoin miners as being something that is in direct opposition to the grid, it betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of our business model and of how the grid itself operates. So it was really disappointing to see this again from The Economist, a publication which historically, I mean, this is a newspaper that's been around for over 100 years. Historically, they usually get things right. They're usually ahead of the curve. They're good at prognosticating, but this is a particular instance where I think this story was very much below The Economist, below their historical reputation. And it's unfortunate, but it's part and parcel of the way they've reported on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency over the last decade. And to that point, I want to bring up one of the most memorable articles on crypto I've seen from The Economist in the last few years. Dylan, do you mind bringing up, technically this is the fourth link we sent, the other Economist cover. You could pull that up. So people who have been involved in the industry for many years might remember this piece and remember the PTSD that they associated with it. So in November of 2022, mind you, this was in the midst of the SBF fraud, the FTX blow up. It looked like truly the world was ending. And The Economist on November 17th, 2022, ran this headline, "Is this the end of crypto?" Can you bring it up one more time, Dylan? So is this the end of crypto? And then you have meteors coming down. I guess, sort of intoning this idea that this is the apocalyptic event for the cryptocurrency industry. It's over. Again, keep in mind that date, November 17th, 2022. Now, Dylan, if you could move to the very next graphic, what happened this very week, November 17th, 2022? We try to narrow in on that exact date, and we got within 48 hours. Within 48 hours of this Economist article being published, we witnessed the Pico Schmico bottom of the Bitcoin bear market. They called it to the day almost. The very week that the Bitcoin market bottomed is technically when the bull market started again. So that's what's so fascinating about so much of mainstream media is that it's in many ways a counter signal for people who are trading the Bitcoin markets. When you see news stories about how Bitcoin is dead, how cryptocurrency is never coming back, how it was all Tulip Mania 2.0, that's usually a sign that the market is about to turn. And then conversely, when you see headlines that Bitcoin is reaching a new paradigm, cryptocurrency is the tech sector of the future, and that now is a good time to buy, that's usually a signal that it's a good time to sell. Crazy how it works. And it's sad that the Economist of all publications has lowered themselves to the level of acting like an MSNBC in reporting on crypto. But it is what it is. And Brian, I think this raises an interesting point. You know, Bitcoin's been around for well over a decade now. Why does the mainstream media get Bitcoin and crypto so consistently wrong time and time again?
Well, I guess I'll start with my tinfoil hat, which with, conspiracy theories that are true. There is an ideological aversion to it. And The Economist alluded to it in its story. It said like there's sort of a bit of a libertarian ethos behind Bitcoin. When you think about it, people custodying their own assets. They don't need a bank. They don't need a permission from a government. They want to be empowered. And individual empowerment is not consistent with, for example, the Soros Foundation's, kind of desire for a new world order, one world government, top down centralized control. Bitcoin is a decentralized network by design. And so I think there is a philosophical piece to it. I also think that there is a misunderstanding, purposeful or otherwise, because the issues are complicated. That's my charitable view, is that, it took us a while to learn these things. And when you're working in the business, you absorb a lot of information. We can't expect everybody to know everything we know because we live and breathe this every day. So there is a misunderstanding. There's still a lot of Americans. Now, there are tens of millions who are holding Bitcoin and learning about it and understand it, but it's not everybody. There's still a learning curve here. So my I surmise that when you're dealing with various media outlets, there is an ideological agenda that they're pushing. That's obvious with The Economist in this piece. This was clickbait, anti-Bitcoin smear, I think, for ideological purposes. They took outrageous liberties with these characterizations in this piece. And frankly, they've discredited themselves. But with respect to the mainstream media in general, I think there's some of that, but it's also the learning curve. And I think as more Americans adopt Bitcoin and learn about it, the media is going to have to catch up a little bit and memory hold their own ignorance to some degree. I think the tide is changing. Daniel Batten, who we enjoy all his content on Twitter, he debunks a lot of mistaken or malicious articles. And even he's pointed out there are a lot of new peer reviewed articles and stories coming out that are more favorable to Bitcoin. The tide is changing as people learn more. So I don't know. What do you think? Do you have any other opinions on that?
Yeah, I think that so much of 24/7 cable news and so much of digital media today is purely reactive. So I think they have an obvious incentive when it looks like Bitcoin is crashing and dying, or when it looks like it's going to the moon, just to report that and that alone, and not have the long term thinking that you need to understand how this market truly operates. But I also think that a lot of these legacy publications, and I would include The Economist, it would include others such as, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, they are so tied up in the world of traditional finance that traditional finance itself has a bias against Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies.
Great
And I
point.
think that trickles over into legacy media reporting on the subject. I don't know how much longer it can continue like this, though, before they discredit themselves completely. This morning, I was listening to Morning Brew, and the Morning Brew bros were reporting on the Economist article, and they said, "Oh, of course this happens. These Bitcoin miners, they don't produce anything." That's a direct quote. They don't make anything. And I was just beside myself. We don't make anything. This is a commodity market the size of silver. This is the 10th largest asset in the world. It's the best performing investment of the last decade. It's the hardest form of currency that's ever been invented. It is, not according to me, but according to people like Larry Fink at BlackRock, digital gold is potentially the best performing asset of the next decade as well. To say that Bitcoin miners don't make anything is either being entirely disingenuous or being outright ignorant. And I'm not quite sure which one of those it is with mainstream media. Maybe it's a mixture of both. Either
Yeah.
way, it's disappointing, and we're likely to see more of the same, but I'm hopeful that in the near future that begins to change.
Yeah, with comments like that and with articles like this one, they should be embarrassed. They should be embarrassed. This is, if I were the professor of journalism grading that article, like I said, I would have given it an F. And you would think that these institutions, with every resource at their disposal to learn and get things right, they would do it better. We started off, I think the industry kind of started off saying we need to educate. We're at the point where when we see these hostile lies and smears, it's time to just call them out and go direct to the Bitcoin community and our audiences.
Yeah. Looks like we're having a technical difficulty over there. So well, we're getting
So,
Brian. Oh, Brian, can you hear us?
yes, I can hear you.
Sorry, it froze for about 30 seconds there.
Okay. I'll wrap up my thought. I was just saying that, these reporters and these commenters have had plenty of time to learn. They have all the information they need at their disposal, and they're choosing not to use that. They're choosing to get it wrong instead. And so I think it's time for the, Bitcoin community to just call them out directly to our audiences and just say, this is fake news. It's wrong, probably ideologically driven. And unfortunately, they should be embarrassed. I don't think they have any shame, but if they did, they would feel it. And it's just time to fight back. There's a communications consultant, and I apologize, I can't remember her name right now, but she's puts great content out on Twitter, and she was pointing out there's no more need for these intermediaries. Executives in business or people in the Bitcoin industry can just go direct to audiences through social media or other means, podcasts, and just deliver their message directly. You don't have to worry about these intermediaries. And so I think that's, one of my takeaways from this whole incident is that we shouldn't be afraid to just call them out, say, this is false, and explain our perspective directly to our audiences. So that's part of the reason we're here today.
Yeah, part of the reason we're here today, and Brian, part of the reason you and I are in the industry that we're in is that Bitcoin exists to remove the middleman being the banks, the middleman being people who manage your money for you as opposed to you managing your money yourself. And we're seeing media face the same crisis that traditional finance is facing to a certain extent, where more and more people are realizing that either middlemen aren't needed or not as many middlemen are needed because these intermediaries oftentimes take information, they disseminate it to the public through their own filter with their own bias, and it just makes the information environment much harder to parse, much harder to understand. And more people are waking up to the fact that you can just go direct. That's what Twitter, or I should say X, is for, right? And that's why we're fortunate that we have the opportunity to correct the record like you and I are right now on this podcast on X, to give people the facts, just the facts, and we'll help them decide for themselves what is true and what is false. So yeah, really, man, this article gets my blood boiling, man. When I woke up this morning and then when I heard the Morning Brew podcast in connection with it, I was just so upset. So I'm glad we had a chance to talk about this today. Speaking of,
And we can move on from this. I think we're beating I think this horse has been dead for 20 minutes and we're still beating it. But for what it's worth, like there are a lot of really sharp Bitcoiners who have been debunking this story. And just, the tweet that Dylan threw up with my, grading them an F and putting the first 10 things I noticed that were just completely false. Like that tweet's got more views, likes, and retweets than the actual Economist articles tweet. So I think we're drowning them out pretty well.
Yeah, it's working. Definitely working. And, we talk about how the mainstream media can get it wrong, how reporters can get it so wrong. Let's talk next about how politicians continue to get it wrong on Bitcoin. This is especially timely with the Democratic National Convention having taken place just last week. So, when the DNC released their platform, of note, there was zero mention whatsoever of Bitcoin, crypto, or digital assets. And this stands in stark contrast to the Republican Party platform of just a few weeks prior, in which we really talked about Bitcoin, digital assets, and even being against CBDCs in that platform. Dylan, do you mind pulling up the tweet from Nick Carter on this point? This tweet is really interesting because it just shows how much Republicans are vying for the crypto vote as opposed to Democrats. So in the Republican Party platform, there was a pledge to end the crypto crackdown, to fight against the establishment of a CBDC, to defend the right to mine, the right to self custody, and the right to transact freely. It was explicitly pro Bitcoin and pro crypto. And then in the background, you have the Democratic Party pretending that it is pivoting towards cryptocurrency, that it is intent on making up for the mistakes of the Biden presidency and establishing itself as a pro innovation, pro crypto party. But not many people are buying this, and for good reason. So, Brian, I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on the DNC convention, the Democratic National Convention, as it pertains to crypto?
Well, they were silent on it because their position, at least the Biden Harris administration's position on these issues, is so deeply unpopular. So they didn't really want to give the industry another reason to, flog them. There's also some internal dissent. There are a lot of young Democrats who appreciate Bitcoin for cross-border transfers, for financial inclusion. I mean, there's a lot of positive things about Bitcoin and crypto for Democrats, and you've seen some pretty high profile ones. Congressman Wiley Nickel, Congressman Ro Khanna, Mark Cuban coming out and saying, like, the party really needs to get with the program on these things. So I think they couldn't reach a consensus place, and so they just didn't talk about it. But what we've seen, with some of these high profile Democrats, sort of wish casting their policy preferences onto the Harris campaign like a Rorschach test. But really, what we have to base our prognostications is the last 4 years. And they've tried to cut off digital asset companies' bank accounts. They've tried to create a Bitcoin mining registry and take away access to electricity. They've tried to tax our electricity. They've tried to really take the concerted viewpoint that they want to drive the industry out of the US. So it's been unabashedly hostile. So, and I think that, the Democrats I mentioned see this as a losing position. And so they're trying to urge the party to make some changes. But so far that they haven't done that. And the Harris campaign has even hired two of the biggest antagonists of the industry as policy advisors on the campaign. The signals we're seeing are not positive, notwithstanding some of these other Democrats urging changes. We just don't see those changes happening at this point, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's super disappointing. You mentioned one of those policy staffers advising Kamala Harris on this issue. His name is Bharat Ramamurthy, who that name might ring a bell for some people because he's been on MSNBC, or excuse me, CNBC the past couple of days, touting Kamala Harris's tax plan that includes a tax on unrealized capital gains, which is in and of itself absurd and would do terrible things for our economy. Imagine, for example, having Bitcoin. It goes up 100% in a year, but you're a long-term holder of Bitcoin. You don't plan to sell for another decade. Even so, Kamala Harris administration wants to tax that Bitcoin, even though you haven't sold it, 25%. It's an absurd idea. And it's being touted by one of Elizabeth Warren's top staffers back in the day, Bharat Ramamurthy, who is one of the chief architects behind Operation Chokepoint 2.0. So given the fact that Ramamurthy himself has taken such a high profile position within the Kamala Harris campaign is very clear sign that any talk of a crypto reset seems to be lip service and lip service only. But Brian, let's zoom out. We've talked about the DNC and the absence of any mention of crypto at the convention itself. Let's talk about the state of the campaign and the DNC more broadly. Let's remind our listeners that just several months ago, Kamala Harris was widely recognized, even by progressive news sources and mainstream media, as being somewhat of an embarrassment to the Biden campaign, someone that they tried to keep in the closet, keep her quiet, don't have her do too many public events because whenever she opens her mouth and goes off script, it's a disaster. She is a living, breathing gaffe machine when she's not tethered to the teleprompter. So, Brian, even so, we had a complete rebrand of Kamala Harris over the last month, where she is the second coming of Barack Obama. It's all hope and joy at the DNC, and it's as if the Democratic Party has rediscovered what they're calling, quote, the politics of joy, whatever the heck that means. But I'm curious, Brian, it seems like the American public, at least the portion of the American public who's all of a sudden supporting Kamala Harris, has had their memories erased. What do you think explains this sudden rebrand of Kamala Harris and the success of this rebrand? And do you think that we've seen peak Kamala yet? Or do you think that the media propaganda will continue to permeate in such a way that more and more Americans get on board the Kamala train?
Well, I think maybe, Dylan, can you pull up my tweet thread on this? And I remember there was a good lesson on brand loyalty. And many voters, most voters, are very brand loyal. They pick a party early in their lives and they stick with that party. So let's go with the second tweet there, I think. Determiner of which brand you're going to be loyal to. I say frequently politics is downstream from culture. That last tweet that Dylan was showing demonstrated that in the urban parts of the country. Now relating it to the election and Bitcoin, Dylan, if you can continue through my. We've seen a lot of data coming out of Stand with Crypto and Coinbase's research, and our friends at Paradigm have done a lot of polling research indicating that there are a lot of voters for whom Bitcoin and crypto is a critical issue in this election, and they're very persuadable. So I'll credit the Trump campaign and the RNC, going back to our earlier discussion, for seeing this as, a resource of voters, of campaign donations, of people who may well decide this election based on these issues. So I just wanted to go through that little history lesson to perhaps explain how Harris went from 36% approval to a competitive candidate. That brand loyalty is very critical. But who's going to decide the election? Those persuadable voters. And who are they? A lot of them are Bitcoiners. So very, very critical election here in 2024. And if Bitcoiners do decide the election, they're going to be a force in our politics for many cycles to come.
Yeah, that point you made about brand loyalty is so interesting. And it's actually a perfect segue to the next portion of our podcast talking about Bitcoin and crypto voters. So, Dylan, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the next article link about. Trying to unseat an incumbent in Ohio who is the chair of the Senate Banking Committee. You go to the next link as well. That crypto super PACs, surprise, surprise, are throwing their money behind people who are pro crypto. I don't know what's short sighted or stupid about any of that. Much to the contrary, it seems like if you're a crypto PAC, that's exactly what you should be doing. And Brian, you brought up that brand loyalty to Bitcoin in particular. Let's play a Fox News clip that talks about that particular demographic that you're describing, the Bitcoin voter. Do you mind pulling up the Fox News clip, Dylan?
And the reality is, look, crypto could move the needle. 1 in 5 Americans say that rather own crypto, and 73% of those say that crypto is going to make a difference in terms of who they support as a candidate. It's also why the digital currency is becoming a key point in the presidential election. Research from the Stand with Crypto PAC, listen to this, shows that in 5 swing states, the crypto voter outnumbers the 2020 presidential margin by 8 times. So which candidate is going to capitalize on this remains to be seen. Obviously, President Trump has gone all in. He's even teasing a decentralized finance platform. Vice President Harris, her team is meeting with a number of different key leaders, but she has not shared a official campaign stance yet. So remains to be seen there, Madison.
Okay, so that is such an interesting statistic from that piece there. 21% of voters own crypto. And of that 21%, 73% say that it will more or less be a pivotal issue for them at the ballot box. So it's that particular demographic that you've zeroed in on, Brian, and that I think for you was the inspiration behind the Bitcoin Voter Project. There's a lot of pro-crypto advocacy organizations out there, such as Stand with Crypto, but you found a particular niche in the market with Bitcoin voters. Can you give us an update on the Bitcoin Voter Project and how things are going with that particular organization and where things might go from here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and for anybody interested in getting involved, signing up, you can go to bitcoinvoterproject.org, follow us on social media at Bitcoin Voter on X, and it's on TikTok, it's on Instagram. I think the Facebook account is facebook.com/Bitcoin Voter Project. We've done a national voter modeling project. We're running digital ads, putting out video content, getting hundreds of signups every day, every week. There are thousands of people that are gravitating to it because we knew the market was there. We knew that Bitcoiners are many and they are passionate, and we want their voice to be heard in this election. It's a little bit counterintuitive because Bitcoiners tend to be, in favor of individual empowerment and decentralization, but we're trying to get them a little bit centralized so that we can market to them and have them talk to their legislators, show up at the ballot box to vote. And we think it's going to have a very meaningful impact in races around the country. But relating back to the PAC situation in Ohio, I think that particular donor was blinded by his brand loyalty because, Sam, as you pointed out, the chair of the Senate Banking Committee has been hostile and unhelpful to the industry. His opponent is a pro-Bitcoin, pro-crypto candidate who even started his own blockchain technology business. And so, it makes perfect sense that they would do that. His outrage is silly and nonsensical, and I think based more on emotion than it is logic. So, that's one of the key efforts. That may be the single most important seat for these issues in this election. And to expect one of the biggest crypto PACs to sit on the sidelines of that race is absurd. It's just completely unrealistic. I don't know what he was expecting, but I think that the PAC is doing exactly what you should expect it to do in that race.
Yeah, agreed. And I think people who are very progressive, but also pro Bitcoin, there's a dwindling number of them because it's becoming increasingly harder to hold those two positions at the same time, unfortunately. But they need to recognize that in the current race, you got to go with the horse that's going to win and the horse that is backing your beliefs. And in this case, it appears to be the Republican Party. I don't think it will always be that way. I do think there's a future where hopefully Bitcoin becomes bipartisan again, but that's just the reality of the political situation in 2024. Speaking of the political race, really interesting news last week with the release of the members of Trump's transition team. So, Dylan, if you wouldn't mind pulling up that story. So, Donald Trump has picked his transition team. His transition team will include Donald Trump Jr., Eric Trump, J.D. Vance, and then Linda McMahon and Howard Lutnick. So, what's most fascinating, if you can go to the next clip, Dylan, what's most fascinating about these particular picks is that it signals Trump's favor of which pro-Trump think tanks he is most in favor of. And so there's the Heritage Foundation, which had Project 2025, which has been a real stumbling block for Republicans on the campaign trail. And then there's another organization called the America First Policy Institute. This organization, Linda McMahon, who's on the Trump transition team, has very close ties with AFPI, the America First Policy Institute. And this particular pick for his transition team just shows where Trump's favor appears to lie at the moment. Brian, before we talk about the Bitcoin angle on the transition team, do you have any thoughts on what these particular selections might say about the ongoing tug of war for influence between AFPI and Heritage?
Yeah, I mean, they all, I think, want to push this kind of America First agenda, but I think where Heritage sort of ran into a bit of a brick wall there, where Trump ended up disowning them and the campaign kind of denounced them. My, I guess, kind of inside baseball read on it was that they were putting forth very detailed, very lengthy policy positions that weren't necessarily vetted with Trump or his campaign. They just sort of asserted these things and then tried to attach them to Trump. And I don't think that worked well, obviously. They hadn't really been vetted. And Trump said, there's some stuff I agree with. There's a lot of stuff I don't agree with, but this is not my campaign. These are not necessarily my positions. Whereas AFPI is more about, here's how Trump governed in the first term and sort of extrapolating his own ideas. And allowing room for him, I think, and his team to have a little bit more of a say, a little bit more input. It's a little bit more closely tied with him, I think. So I think the approach that AFPI took was the more pragmatic one, and I think they've been rewarded for that. But I'm excited to dig into the Bitcoin subject matter here because I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, so let's look at that. Keep up the tweet from David Bailey. So this tweet shows just how bullish this transition team is for Bitcoin. 4 out of the 5 people overseeing Trump's transition team own Bitcoin. That's wild. That's 80% of his transition team is pro Bitcoin, including JD Vance, who, by the last count, owned $250,000 worth of Bitcoin, $250,000 in Bitcoin. That's a substantial stack right there. And again, really bullish for the industry. Brian, what do you
Well,
make? Go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say he's also added RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard as honorary co-chairs, and RFK Jr. was even uh, ahead, at least in the timeline, was even ahead of Trump in embracing Bitcoin, and said that he's put a lot of his wealth in Bitcoin, and he bought Bitcoin for all of his, I think, 7 kids. So from that story that you shared, it's actually, I think, gotten even more bullish on the Trump side. I'm not sure what Tulsi Gabbard's position is on Bitcoin, but I think given her proclivities, she would sort of be a natural ally. So I actually think it's gotten even more bullish since that story came out in terms of the Trump world's adoption of Bitcoin, which I think should give Bitcoiners a lot of optimism and be a pretty clear signal to those voters that we just talked about as to, which candidate is more likely to be favorable on your issues.
Agreed 100%. And we talked about JD Vance and how much Bitcoin he owns. Let's also talk about Howard Lutnick. That guy is as bullish on Bitcoin as you can get. He actually spoke right after Trump at Bitcoin Nashville, which, for those who don't know, is the biggest Bitcoin conference in the world. Dylan, do you mind playing that clip of Howard Lutnick's speech at Bitcoin Nashville?
Cantor Fitzgerald and all of its partners are a fan of Bitcoin. Does Cantor Fitzgerald own Bitcoin? A shed load of Bitcoin. My view is Bitcoin, like gold, should be free to trade everywhere in the world. And as the largest wholesaler in the world, we are going to do everything in our power to make it so. Bitcoin is the same as gold, and Bitcoin should trade the same as gold everywhere in the world without exception and without limitation.
All right, there you go. Howard Lutnick saying Bitcoin is the same as gold. It should trade the same as gold anywhere in the world without exception. So this is a huge Bitcoin bull. And Brian, I know you used to work at Treasury. You worked in Manhattan for several years. You've always had a lot of exposure to the traditional finance industry. Can you give us the TLDR on Howard Lutnick and why he's such a big name, both in the traditional finance space and now in the cryptocurrency space?
Yeah, Howard Lutnick is a legend. CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, obviously a huge sterling brand and reputation. Cantor Fitzgerald actually suffered greatly because of 9/11. They were in the World Trade Center and they lost a tremendous amount of their kind of nucleus of power and brain power, and obviously wonderful people whose families suffered greatly. And Howard has brought that company, really back to be this premier institution, and his employees love him. President Trump has known him for decades. To have this titan of the finance industry recognizing the value of Bitcoin is really a pivotal event, I think, in the history of this asset. So really great to have his support. I think he's known as a really brilliant guy. So putting a smart business leader on the transition team, I think, was very wise, maybe slightly unorthodox, but really interesting outside the box move by the Trump campaign. I think the people are pretty impressed and happy with that choice.
Yeah, it's an exciting choice for the industry. And again, very good signs for the future if Trump's elected. We'll see what happens in November.
Yep.
But you mentioned Wall Street. Let's talk about another version of Wall Street happening in Texas right now to close things out today. Brian, do you want to say more on that?
Sure. So, in almost a further debunking of The Economist, the pro business environment Texas is open for business. The governor and lieutenant governor and other leaders like to say. And that has resulted in a lot of really impressive brain power and large corporations moving operations to Texas. And now it's gaining what appears to be an even bigger market share of the finance industry in Texas than there is in New York, leading to this new moniker in the Wall Street Journal. Dylan, you can throw that one up. Everybody's heard of Wall Street, and now they're hearing about Y'all Street. Shout out to Texas's wonderful, welcoming and friendly and pro-business culture. So it's just showing that Texas really is open for business, and some of the biggest institutions in the world are setting up shop in Texas. So really good for the citizens there. Lots of jobs being created, a lot of economic growth coming to that state. I think a lot of people were voting with their feet during COVID and moving away from states that had very restrictive environments to states like Florida, like Texas, like Tennessee, and some others that really welcomed a lot of people with open arms and with pro-business and pro-freedom political programs. So good for Texas. It is thriving. And I think Y'all Street is a very funny and very optimistic name. And in what other publication should it be published than the Wall Street Journal? I think the irony there is very funny.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And I agree with everything you said, Brian. I mean, red states and blue states are in constant competition for big business. And I think for decades, really, blue states almost had a monopoly on finance and on tech. But more and more, there's competition out there where red states are incentivizing businesses, whether it be in finance, tech, manufacturing, really industry. They're luring these companies to their states with lower taxes, more sensible regulation, and a business friendly environment. And Texas is the perfect example of that. I was in Austin for a couple days earlier in the week, and it was just fascinating to see how much they're building there. There's a housing crisis in this country, especially in big cities where housing supply is in such short demand. But one of the places where that housing crisis is being truly alleviated is Austin. Why? Because they're building so much. It's just sensible policy. There's not as much red tape in place in these red states. And so it makes it a much easier place to do business. That's why you have Bitcoin miners flocking there. That's why you now have traditional finance firms flocking there as well. So, Y'all Street, I would love to meet with some people in that industry because I think they pair the sort of intensity of your typical banker with the charm of your typical Texas cowboy. So that's a really fun story and honestly kind of a fun note to go out on. Brian, is there anything else you want to bring up before we close things out today?
No, I'm just trying to think of what the opposite kind of corollary would be if there's going to be a big bolo tie or cattle ranching renaissance in Manhattan. I doubt it. I think it's pretty much a one-way flow. But no, this has been a very interesting and fun conversation. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Like and subscribe. Follow us on X at MorgansternNJ, at Sam Lyman33. Send us questions, comments, criticisms, whatever your thoughts may be. But thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.